Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Top 10 Reasons Why Supplier Qualification Fails, brought to you in conjunction with Browse. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for the event today, Gil Dieckhoff and Mark Bryant. Gil is the Director of Professional Services at Browse and is an industry expert in the areas of supplier qualification and health and safety. Before joining Browse, Gil had 20 years of experience at Caterpillar, where he led a multifunctional team that developed Caterpillar's corporate-level contractor and supplier management process. Gil also served as a corporate process owner for Caterpillar during that time, and he led the implementation of a supplier qualification and management program in manufacturing facilities located in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and India. We'll also be joined on the line by Mark Bryant. Mark is the Director of International Business Development at Browse, and he's responsible for partnering with client personnel in procurement, engineering, security, and health and safety to develop customized service platforms to pre-qualify, assess, and monitor compliance based on an organization's unique requirements. So before we get started with the main presentation, I'd like to let you know that we will be opening the floor to questions from our audience for a few minutes after the presentation. So please do submit any questions that you have to us using the questions tab that you can see on your user interface. We will collate those and ask as many of the questions as we can. If we're not able to get through all of the questions, we will pass them over to Mark and Gil after the event, and they will follow up with you directly. We're also going to be conducting 2 live polls during the presentation that we'd really like you to take part in. The first of these we're going to do now, and Gil can then provide us with some insight on the results for us. The second one will take place later in the webinar. So we're going to launch that poll now, and the question for you to answer is: how many contractors and suppliers does your company manage? And the options there for you are 1 to 99, 100 to 249, 250 to 499, 500 to 999, and more than 1,000. So we're going to leave this up for just about 20 or 30 seconds. So if you can get on there and click your answer straight away, we'll be able to review the results. And while I've got your attention, I'd just like to remind you again that we will be having a Q&A at the end, so we're really looking forward to a lively discussion there. So please do feel free to submit any questions that you have about your own processes or anything about Gil's experience, and we can come back to that at the end. So looks like we've got lots of responses in, so let's have a look at the results. Okay, so we can see here that we've got the largest group of answers there is in the 1 to 19 category. It's 18%. And oh no, sorry, I've got some eye defects. We've got more than 1,000. 65% of our audience have more than 1,000 suppliers there. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Gil. Welcome, Gil. Very glad to have you on the line. And what do you think about the results of our initial poll?
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. I appreciate it. Glad to be here, and hopefully the presentation today will provide some value to those folks that are listening in. Yeah, it's interesting, the results. It sounds like the majority of our, at least the people that are online so far, are working with a sizable supply chain, a large number of suppliers or contractors. And although I've got experience with companies that are very small with a very limited amount of suppliers and contractors, I also have, I would say, I'm more heavily weighted towards the larger scale companies. Having worked at Caterpillar for 20 plus years, we were on a scale where we had 300 plus facilities worldwide, and more than 10,000 suppliers and contractors worldwide. So I kind of cut my teeth in this area working with really large volume supply chain people, so I'm very comfortable speaking and hopefully being able to answer questions that are related to those larger numbers. Okay, I think without further ado, I'll go ahead and I'll get started with the presentation. Again, if you guys think of questions while we go through this, you can submit them online and we'll try to get to those at the end. I'll work through this fairly methodically, and you'll see that there isn't a lot of verbiage on the slides. I tend to just speak from experience and use the slides to guide me, so that's the way we'll do it. First of all, I think maybe one of the biggest questions that some of the folks on the line and maybe others might be wondering is, why is it even important to qualify my supply chain, or why do I want to do this? Well, it really boils down to any company that's in business is in business to make money. And in order to do that, you have to be able to identify risks to your enterprise or your business, risks in your supply chain, and then you have to be able to mitigate or control or eliminate that risk. And qualification of your supply chain is designed to help you do that. And there are a lot of different sources of potential risk that your supply chain could be adding to your business. I'm a health and safety professional, so I tend to think of things from the health and safety standpoint. In the U.S. we typically say EH&S, environmental health and safety. I think most of Europe usually spins that around and safety, health, and environmental and calls it SHE or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, your contractors or suppliers that are working on your site have the potential to add a lot of risk to your site and to your operations based on the type of work they do. And that can include things from injuries to fatalities, releases of hazardous materials, etc. And there's a lot of reason why a intelligent company would like to limit or eliminate that risk. That's especially on the safety and the environmental side. You've got the moral and ethical reasons for trying to eliminate or control that risk. Clearly, we don't want anybody getting hurt on our sites, whether they're our employees or contractor or supplier employees. We don't want to be doing harmful or damaging things to the environment, etc. So I tend to think mostly in those areas, although there's clearly a lot of other areas where your supply chain can add risk. There's the potential to add risk to you from the regulatory side, legal risk, having suppliers or contractors, and I'll use those terms. Sorry, I'm American, so I think of it kind of that way. To me, I typically view these as contractors, but I know in a lot of the rest of the world we're talking about suppliers, and so if I use those two terms during the presentation today, I'm not trying to denote one thing or the other. I'm basically using those, interchanging those with the same meaning. So your supply chain, they can present financial risk to your operations. And then finally, if you roll all of those things together, the EH&S risk, the potential for regulatory and legal and financial risk, those can all boil down to, the potential to cause operational interruptions to whatever type of operations you might have. They can lead to quality issues and things like that. And all of those things in the end, the potential risk means there's potential risk of financial impact to your company or your operation. And that is, unquestionably why, or the main reason why most companies that are working now are looking at, they're either already doing it or they're looking at implementing some type of qualification for their suppliers. One of the things that jumps up in this area too, that unfortunately I've had the real world experience of seeing in multiple locations around the world in my days at Caterpillar and a little bit now at Browse, is looking at brand protection. And you might say, okay, why is Gil bringing up brand protection? Well, I can tell you that in today's business environment, the lines between the client company like yourselves and your suppliers are becoming more and more blurred, more of a gray area. And things that significant events, again, a fatality, some type of environmental issue or something like that that may be entirely caused by one of your suppliers and out of your control, so to speak, but if it takes place on one of your locations or one of your sites, that has the potential to have a very negative impact on your brand and your image, because a lot of times what I've historically seen is when something catastrophic like that happens, the press tends to grab onto the name of the company that owns the site or the location, which is typically also the bigger and the more well-known company, and they link that incident to that hosting company, so to speak. Very, very real examples of that I've seen in my days working for Caterpillar. Our corporate headquarters and some of our largest manufacturing plants in the world were located in Peoria, Illinois, here in the U.S. And just a couple of years back, we had a contractor that was involved with moving materials and using high lift fork trucks to move those materials. And they had the unfortunate event of actually tipping a fork truck over, which resulted in the death of one of the contractor employees. Now that's all, that's serious and that's bad enough as it is, but the fact that the local media here in Peoria, Illinois, which is where Caterpillar's world headquarters is, the next day all of the local media said, that it was a Caterpillar incident, it was a Caterpillar employee that was killed, it was Caterpillar that was, at fault for this or whatever, when in fact it wasn't. It happened on a Caterpillar site. It was a very unfortunate incident, but in fact it was a contractor employee doing contract work that was involved in that incident. But unfortunately, the media, which should know better in Caterpillar's hometown, threw that out there as being a Caterpillar problem and a Caterpillar incident. And it's those kind of things that can get out into the media, into the mainstream media, and out to the general population, and can really have the potential to have a negative impact on your brand. And so, again, if we can identify and hopefully control, eliminate, or mitigate risk, we cut down on the risk to damaging our brand. And so it's also an important tool in helping to protect that. And we all work very, very hard to build our company image, to the highest level possible. And so anything that can possibly damage that, we certainly want to know about it, and we want to try to control that risk. In the end, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, I'm a health and safety guy by trade, but again, it doesn't negate the fact that if a company's in business, they're in business typically to make money. And the only way to really do that is to add value or provide value to both your customers and your shareholders. And so as we work through this process and we talk about the benefits and what we're trying to do with a supplier qualification process, that has a lot of positive impact on your customers. And again, we have a saying here in the U.S., and that is that the customer is always right. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to provide value to those customers so that they keep coming back to us. And by putting a supplier qualification process in place, you're taking a significant step, again, in identifying potential risk and controlling that risk, and therefore having, the least amount of potential impact on your customers. And so it's critical from that standpoint as well. And again, I already mentioned shareholders too. Again, we want to add value to our shareholders as well. By doing that, controlling that risk, you're running probably a more profitable business. Your brand and your image is more highly regarded. That increases your shareholder value, which then increases your ability to have investment in your company or your operations, and continue to have happy investors. And that's a positive in any sense in the business world. So we really want to focus on the value this provides not only to ourselves as the companies, but also to our shareholders and our customers. Okay. Having given you a little bit of background now on why we might want to talk about this or do this or why it's important, I'm going to jump right into the top 10 reasons in my experience that supplier contractor qualification can fail, and hopefully not just talk about the failure points, but give you also some hints and ideas on how to address that, proactively address that, and make sure you don't get into a failure mode, so to speak. And I'll preface this by saying the top 10 are not listed in any type of ranking or order, with the one caveat that in my mind, the one that I'm going to talk about first is the most important and carries the most weight. But the other 9 out of the 10, so to speak, again, I didn't try to rank them. They all play a critical or can play a critical role in the failure or success of your program. And in my mind, they all carry pretty much equal weight, with the exception of what I've got on here as the first one, and that is the lack of leadership commitment. In my experience, and just to very quickly give you a background of what I did for Caterpillar, back in 2008, I was one of the managers for Caterpillar at the corporate level. I was a corporate safety and industrial hygiene manager, and we had a couple of, unfortunately, we had a series of contractor fatalities that happened in a very short amount of time at different Caterpillar locations around the world, and that really got the attention of our CEO at the time. At that point we were about 5 years into a massive cultural change at Caterpillar, with a focus on safety of our employees, and we had made tremendous, in fact, world-class improvements in the injury and illness rates of our employees at Caterpillar, and so the entire company and the CEO was very focused on that and aware of that. Well, then we had this series of contractor fatalities, and it really got the attention of our CEO. He came to our director, corporate director of EH&S, and said, I'm not happy about this. Clearly, we take the health and safety of our employees, to the highest level possible, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that for our supply chain as well. Anybody that's working on our property, I want you to find a way to control this risk, and I want you to implement it on a global basis. Well, that ended up becoming my project for Caterpillar on a worldwide basis, and I can tell you that it was about a 6 to 9 month process from start to finish for us to get our contractors, what we call a contractor safety management process, up and in place at the corporate level. And it would have been a real struggle to achieve that if it didn't get and wasn't regularly getting communicated and supported by our CEO and the executive office at Caterpillar. And so, I know I'm talking to companies of a lot of a different wide range of scope and size here in the presentation today. Everything probably from small employers with a very small number of employees, all the way up to possibly multinational companies. And it doesn't really matter what size your company is. You have to have a leadership commitment to do this type of thing. Because the supply chain impacts so much of your business. Because of that, executive or leadership support is a must, because it does tie into a lot of everything that your company does. And in order to get that leadership commitment, they have to be convinced of the value to their operations. Probably no leader, worth anything is going to commit resources to a process or something that doesn't add value, doesn't add to the bottom line of their operations. And so it's very important, and we'll talk about communications as we get farther into this, that the leadership clearly understands and has the perception that a supplier qualification process is adding value and benefit to their operations, because it can be seen to be fair if the understanding is not there and they don't get a good understanding of the value that's there. It can be seen as, you know, hey, it's just an additional cost. What am I really getting out of it besides more expense? It can be seen as a resource draw, and we'll talk about resources as we go through this. It can be seen as, you know, just adding another level of bureaucracy to the operations. And so up front, if your company is not already involved in using supplier qualification, one of the things that you're going to have to get done right up front is to get buy-in and support from your executive leadership. And the only way to really do that is to show them the value of what you're trying to accomplish. So the next 9 pieces of this really will add up and help you to be able to do that. And I'll say that, you know, if you're at a bigger company, you're probably going to need not only executive level leadership, but if you've got multiple, you know, sites or locations, depending on whether you're, you know, manufacturing or a service industry or whatever it is that you're in, you're probably going to struggle to be successful as well if you don't have, you know, a champion or a leader at the site or the local level as well. Because typically what I've seen, either from the Caterpillar side or from any of the companies that I've worked with over the years and that I work with now at Browse, it's typically the site manager that dictates and decides what's going to go on inside the 4 walls of whatever he's responsible for. So it's important that you hold on to that and let that sink in as well too. It's clearly important to have executive level leadership, but then if you're again working for a company that's got multiple locations in that, whoever is the leader or leadership team at those locations, you also need to ensure that you've got their buy-in and support. Anything that you try to implement and accomplish and make successful, just being honest, it's going to fail if you don't have support, you know, at the local and at the higher levels of the company. It just will not work. Okay, so again, the next 9 failure points, I'll call them. We'll talk through these as well, and this will help also, I think, fill in the gaps for what your leadership needs to understand if you go into something like this. And so one of the other failure points is not understanding your internal stakeholder needs. First of all, you have to identify who your stakeholders are and understand what it is that they want and the difference between what they want and what they need. And so you need to be very thoughtful and very understanding of who the stakeholders within your business might be that will be impacted and hopefully benefit by a supplier qualification program. Typically the groups that tend to get the most involved with this type of program and then also reap the most benefit from it, certainly safety or environmental health and safety, but procurement is purchasing, whatever term you want to apply to it. They are a key player, a key beneficiary, and a key user of the process. They'll be one of your major stakeholders, and as you work through and develop the process, it'll have to be integral to everything that your procurement or your purchasing team and processes does. Clearly, your operations folks, if you're going to use qualification to control access to your facilities, if you use security, perhaps lack of a better term, to control access in and out of your facilities, they will be a key stakeholder that will have to be involved with it. Insurance is typically a very big issue, and it's typically a key element of a supplier qualification program. And so if you've got a group within your company that manages, administers, supplier insurance, or whether that's potentially rolled in with the procurement group as well. You'll need to take that into consideration as well. But typically insurance is one of the things that everybody usually measures and tracks through a supplier qualification process, so they'll need to be involved. And just coming back to the slide a little bit, you'll have to have some face-to-face, heart-to-heart meetings and discussions with these stakeholders to, again, identify what is it they need. What's this process or this program going to provide to them, and how do they need that information delivered? How do they need controls put in place? You need to clearly understand that, and then you also need to understand their wants or their nice-to-haves, and basically prioritize those and figure out, what's the difference between the wants and the needs, and then do I have a solution? Can I provide a solution that meets all their needs, and can it also, address the wants on top of that? Very important. I'll tell you that if you miss or overlook or don't get the support and buy-in of one of your key stakeholders, your program's going to struggle and you're going to have a hard time making it successful. You really have to have everybody playing on the same team and working to the same goal in order to make this work, again, because it does tie into so many different parts of your company. So can't stress it enough. Make sure you do a good job of identifying who your stakeholders are early in your process, get them involved in the process, and make sure that they agree with and support what you're trying to do and that they see the benefit and the value in it. If you've got a team a team of stakeholders that all see the value in this, to be honest, you'll have a really hard time not being successful in putting this type of program in place. Okay, which ties right into, I think, communications. And I just titled this slide Ineffective Communication without going into any more depth on the slide. But I want to be clear on this. The communications have to be effective both internally to your own company and your own employees, and externally to your supply chain and or your contractors, whichever term you like to use. So as you walk through the building of your process, I already talked about how important the buy-in and the support of your executive leadership is, and your stakeholders. And so make sure that you have a very sound communication plan to your internal stakeholders as to a lot of key elements. What are you trying to accomplish? When do you plan to implement this and go live? What value do you expect to get out of this, and how's it going to tie into the processes that we already have in place? Who's going to be included? Some companies will only include, I guess, what I would call the purest term of contractor. Those companies or individuals that are going to come onto your company's property. Other companies include their entire supply chain, even if they never set foot on your company's property. They're pure suppliers. So who's going to be included? What's the cost of the process or the program going to be? And then what's the value? And then finally, and you'll see this in one of the top 10, what type of enforcement are we going to have in place, and how's that going to work? Those things are all critical, not just to your internal stakeholders, but then again also to your external, your supply chain itself or your contractors themselves. You're going to have to make sure that you communicate early and often all of those things, both internally and externally, as you develop your program and you move to implementing it and actually using it to select and manage your supply chain. Can't stress it enough. They say that in one of my hobbies is coaching sports. Obviously, being a leader in multiple companies that I've worked for, the old saying is out there: communicate, communicate, communicate. And I'll stress it again. Typically, you can't communicate too much. So effective communications will be a critical part of this process. Again, you'll notice that these tie in. Lack of supply chain buy-in. when you're talking about selecting, hiring, and paying suppliers or contractors, you're probably not going to be able to get that done without your supply chain, procurement, purchasing, again, whatever term you want to apply to it. Those folks have to be supportive of the process and engaged in the process, or it's never going to work. And I've seen several companies and several CAT facilities fail, at least initially, in their implementation because they didn't have good buy-in or support from their procurement folks. Typically, because you're adding steps to the procurement process, you're probably going to have integration between your qualification system or process and the already existing supply chain process. And so that's going to take some work, and that's probably going to take some, some IT type resources on the purchasing side to make sure that you can integrate and get those systems communicating. You're probably going to have to modify, if you have standard work or process flow or whatever within your procurement processes to include the supplier qualification steps in order to make it work. And again, the supply chain folks will have to see the value in this. I can tell you that in my own experience, supply chain folks can look at this in one of two ways as adding value. They can say, hey, we can use this to kind of eliminate our bad suppliers, which shrinks our supply chain, a little bit or maybe even significantly, which helps us control costs and makes us more streamlined and effective. On the other hand, they can see this as a positive tool to say, look, we can go out now with this process and hopefully identify additional suppliers that we're maybe not using now and use them to drive competitiveness and to have them potentially waiting in the wings if supplier A can't meet our requirements or our time constraints or whatever for a particular project. We know we've already got a qualified second or third or fourth supplier that can do the same type of thing. So if one supplier can't meet our requirements, we've already identified another supplier that meets our our qualification requirements, and we can maybe temporarily or whatever switch the business over to them to make sure that we don't have a negative impact on our operations. So there's a lot of opportunity for the procurement or supply chain folks to really see benefit of this. On the flip side, if they're not convinced of the value, if they're communicated too poorly or whatever, I guarantee your process will fail because you're not going to be able to select, hire, and pay suppliers without the involvement of your supply chain management team. So I've kind of ran the last couple of slides together because I think they naturally fit together. I don't know, Mark, did you have any thoughts on the communication piece that you wanted to add in?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I was actually taking a look at a couple of slides back that you had some information on not understanding the internal stakeholder needs. And I know for my own experiences with working in different countries and different regions, that's certainly the case. It doesn't matter on the type of size of the company or type of business sector that there is a disconnect. So having that harmonization or bringing the internal stakeholder groups together is really key. I think you spoke to one point there about procurement and health and safety managers specifically. And one of the things that these two stakeholder groups really have the ability to influence each other for better safety as it relates to the supply chain. So the procurement, let's say the procurement manager has the opportunity to start the conversation of compliance and safety early in the process, so maybe during tender or contract stages, and they can have a discussion with the contractors or suppliers to comply with the on-site rules. So in essence, by having that internal stakeholder needs understood, they're assisting their health and safety managers by avoiding a reactive response to a supplier issue or a supplier deficiency in the future. So that was just one of the points I thought I'd bring up. I know you moved these slides kind of together, but I thought that would be a valuable input to take a look at that as far as having harmonization across the stakeholder groups.
Yeah, I agree totally. Good. Okay, we'll keep it moving here. Poorly defined or inappropriate standards. And what I mean by this is poorly defined or inappropriate standards for qualification or selection of your supply chain. I've seen this in different settings, and I'll caution you that you probably, if you're not already doing this, if you're considering doing this, you're probably not going to get these exactly right or perfect right out of the gate. This is something that you'll learn from experience and probably modify or tweak those qualification requirements or rules as you go through it. But the failure point is, or some of the potential failure points around these, is if you set those initial qualification standards or rules too strict or too stringent, you'll find out that a lot of your supply base can't meet them. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to eliminate a large portion of your supply chain because potentially the rules or the standards you've set are too strict to meet, right out of the gate or whatever? So it's a potential risk, and it's something I just wanted to point out. I'll also point out that typically what I've seen and what I learned in my own experience is that you can't really apply a one-size-fits-all type of rule set or standards. What's typical in the industry now, and what I did in my own experience at Caterpillar, was to set up different sets of rules or standards for different supplier types. We typically, what we see at Browse and what I did at Caterpillar was to set a couple of risk levels for our contractors. If you've got contractors that are working at heights or going into confined spaces or working with hazardous materials, they typically present a lot more risk than, say, if you're using contractors to clean the office space or something like that. And so we set our rules up, and what we see a lot of our clients do, they'll set rules up based on risk, different sets of rules for different risk levels, and then also a lot of companies will tweak their rules based on the size of the supplier or the contractor. In other words, if you've got maybe a multinational supplier or contractor that's got tens of thousands of employees, what they're already doing and what they're capable of doing might be different from what a small, family-owned business of 5 or 6 employees, what they can do and what they can accomplish. And so, again, just caution you, one size fits all doesn't work in this case, and you'll probably learn as you go through this that your initial set of qualification requirements will probably be modified and amended over time. Really, it's a continuous improvement type process, and probably what you'll have to use is kind of a crawl, walk, run type of mentality when you do this. Start off with some basic rules and qualification requirements, and then kind of follow that continuous improvement path and ramp those up as your program matures. Start expecting and requiring more of your supply chain to drive continuous improvement. Okay, so I do love this slide. It's distinctly American. We talk about our Wild West when the country was originally developing, and here you've got a picture of the local sheriff or whatever. He doesn't look like he's working too hard and enforcing the rules too much. But I can tell you, again, from personal experience, once you put a supplier or a contractor qualification program in place, you have to make sure that you have a mechanism for enforcing the use of that process and following that process, because there can be a lot of negative consequences if you don't. On the internal side, if your internal folks don't want to follow the process and therefore typically if they're not following the process, the risk is that they're going to bring in suppliers that haven't passed your qualification requirements. And I suspect if you're going to do this, you set qualification requirements based on what you feel is important, on going all the way back to the first slide, identifying your risk and controlling that risk. And so if the folks, the team inside your company aren't going to follow the process, and you're not going to do anything to enforce it, then your process will quickly die on the vine. It'll fail, and you won't get the benefits out of it. And so you need to communicate internally, look, we're going to do this, here's the reason why, here's the value we get out of it, and you have to follow it. And in any other situation, if you don't enforce it, you're deluding yourselves potentially into thinking you've identified and eliminated risk when really you haven't, and you're putting your company at a lot more risk. On the external side of things, I'll guarantee you that your suppliers and contractors talk to each other. A lot of them work with each other on projects, and if they find out, if word gets around that you're forcing them to go through this process, they're doing all of these things, but now you're not enforcing it, they'll quickly become disengaged. They won't do what you're asking them to do, and even worse, if contractor A fails your qualification process, yet you continue to allow them to work or select them for new projects, and contractor B is working hard to make sure they meet your qualification requirements, once they find out that contractor A, the guy that isn't meeting it, he's still getting business and still getting work, again, it's gonna cause hard feelings. It's going to cause you problems that you probably don't want to get into. So again, I can guarantee you have to put an enforcement program in place, and you have to keep it going, or you run the risk of having a program failure. Contractor supplier refusal. This can come about for a lot of different reasons, actually. Typically, the biggest reason you're going to get resistance or downright refusal from your contractors or your supply chain is, again, it goes back to the communication. They're probably going to not want to do this if you haven't done a good job of explaining the cost-benefit ratio to them so that they understand that this isn't just another layer of bureaucracy for them, but they're actually going to get benefit out of it as well. And so you have to do a good job of explaining that to them. They may choose or drag their feet or not want to do it because they think maybe the process is too cumbersome, it takes too long, or maybe it adds cost, potentially because they see poor service from either you if you're managing this process in-house, or if you're using a third-party company to do this like Browse does or whatever. Those are all reasons why a lot of times they will hesitate, I guess, to get involved. There are some other things too. I mean, we talked about small-sized companies. Maybe the impact of doing this to them just isn't worth the business, and maybe you have a very small spend with them, and they don't feel like, I use this term loosely, but jumping through the hoops, or if there's costs involved, it's just not justified by the amount of work they do for you, and that's understandable. And so you have to have alternative solutions for what I call your non-standard suppliers. Those that maybe aren't, commonplace type of suppliers. You need to build into your process some type of way to make it a value for them so that they can get engaged with it and participate in it. Mark, any thoughts on this one at all?
Yeah, actually, I was taking a thought to a couple things you'd said on enforcement on the slide before. Sorry, maybe if I keep jumping back, but I know on that, just from personal experience, how important it is, or how key it is for organizations to take a look at assessing all levels of their supply chain. So that could be the direct suppliers, the indirect suppliers, suppliers of materials, vendors, etc. So like you had mentioned, suppliers do talk to one another. So if one set of suppliers is is under a risk mitigation assessment program of some sort. The other one will find out that they're not. It can lead to some issues around, I think, with poor enforcement. I just had a meeting a week and a half ago with a client that had 64 sites, fantastic compliance at a number of their sites, and not so good at a few sites. We were able to use a software product to take a look at their user login history. So we were able to quickly identify that their actual site managers really were the ones that were making the program not as effective, because the corporate office could see quickly that their own users at the local sites were not logging in. Therefore, they were not using the system and enforcing it at the dashboard gate entry type feature. So I think that was one thing that I thought was key to bring up, was at least taking a look at all types, all levels of your suppliers.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I've seen that too in the past. That was I won't say common, but it happened more than once at different CAP facilities for me as well. Good. Yeah, I'm looking at the time. I think I'm a little bit behind where I normally would be, so I'm going to pick the pace up on this just a little bit to hopefully leave time for question and answers at the end. So we'll just keep right on plugging along here. Lack of sophisticated technology. Another way of saying this is managing by spreadsheets. If you're a small company, you might be able to get away with that and make it work just fine. If you're a bigger company and you've got a larger number of suppliers and contractors, relying on spreadsheets is probably a poor choice. You can run the process a lot more effectively and efficiently and with a lot fewer errors, if you have some sophisticated technology or some type of platform that allows a lot of automation and integration of systems. It tends to eliminate a lot of, I would almost call it data entry type errors that might cause problem to your own internal operations by denying suppliers access or whatever, and then creating hard feelings with your suppliers. So, having the availability and the use of more sophisticated technology as a tool to manage this is clearly a benefit. And the flip side of that, managing by spreadsheets, if you're a bigger company anyway, probably not the best plan. There's certainly better ways to do it. This is one too, underestimating the need for administrative support. This can be very surprising. I'll just give you an idea and just a real-world example here. I mentioned when I was at CAT, we were in the process of implementing this we had over 300 facilities worldwide, over 200. We were about 200 at the time, about 240 manufacturing facilities, and we were rolling this out on a global basis. So we had run several Six Sigma projects to look at how we were going to do this, and one of the things that we were trying to figure out was, is it better to manage this supplier qualification process in-house or to use a third party? And if we do it in-house, what type of resources or manpower do we need? Well, we looked at a subset of our facilities. It was a little less than 100 facilities just in the U.S. We estimated, based on what we were trying to accomplish and what we wanted to do, that it was going to take us roughly 13 to 15 full-time employees to manage the process in-house for roughly 90 facilities inside the U.S. And when we looked at that, we started looking at, well, if we're at the high end or even the low end, if we put on 13 full-time employees or whatever, what's it going to cost, from the wage, from the benefit, the training, and all of that type of thing. It was a huge eye-opener to our executive leadership, who thought, the people that were already on staff could just add this to what they were doing, or we could add in a couple, 2 or 3 people or whatever to drive this process. Again, it depends on how much you're wanting to get done and how sophisticated your qualification process is going to be, but the reality is that most of the companies I benchmarked when I was at Caterpillar, and a lot of the clients that I've worked with now from the browse side, almost to a person or to a company, they've underestimated the type of resources required to do this efficiently if you're doing it in-house. If you're not using a third party, if you're not using sophisticated technology to do it, it can be a real eye-opener. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand this back to Gareth because I believe we have a poll question we'd like to ask now. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. We do have the second live poll question. So if everyone listening, if you're ready to take part, the next question is, does your company actively pre-qualify and manage your contractors, suppliers, and vendors? And the possible answers there are yes, internally. Yes, we use a third party. No, we are not actively pre-qualifying. And don't know. So if you'd like to just click ahead on the screen there, and I can see that we are already getting a fair amount of people going. We'll just leave that up for a few more seconds, let you all take part. And once again, a reminder, if you'd like to ask Gil or Mark a question at the end, just go to your questions tab there and submit your questions. We've already had a few in, and we'll try and get us through as many as we can in the time that we've got. So I think we've had all of the responses in. Let's have a look at the results. So yeah, very interesting. You can see 80% of you currently pre-qualify your contractors, suppliers, and vendors internally. 15% use a third party. 20% say that you aren't actively pre-qualifying at the moment, and 5% don't know. Gil, do you have any reflections on those results?
Well, it's a pretty good mix. It's actually a higher percentage that are doing it one way or the other than we normally see in here, and I think it reflects a little bit the nature of our audience today. I think with the vast majority, not all, but I think the vast majority of our attendees today are European-based, and I know that the European requirements for managing contractors and contractor safety are a little bit different, and in some ways more regimented and restricted than it is here in the U.S., which probably explains why we have a higher percentage of the attendees already engaged in some type of contractor management process. So that's good. That'll also help me when we get to the questions at the end. It'll help me formulate my answers a little bit better, understanding, the nature of the group that we've got online with us today. So good deal. All right, very interesting. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to move through these last couple of slides pretty quickly, but they are important nonetheless. Another potential or possible failure point is the belief that compliance is static, or it's a one-time event. I've seen this before in the past where it's viewed as, hey, well, we did a check on their safety performance or their financial performance, or to make sure that they have the right type of insurance coverage. We did it up front when we signed a contract with them or whatever, so we're good to go. The problem with that is most of the data that can be gathered changes over time, and that you don't just want to take a single kind of a snapshot in time and base your judgment of a supplier or contractor on that one moment in time. Things change. And so you have to be very careful about making sure that you're not basing or making decisions on outdated data or expiring documentation, things like that. You want to make sure that it's a continuous process where you're continually updating your information and your data on your suppliers to make sure that it's the most current and therefore presents the most accurate depiction of potential risk brought on by that supplier, which leads right into the fact that it should be a continuous process improvement methodology or approach. You want to go beyond compliance and start driving continuous levels of improvement. Qualification needs to be a part of a total process and a management system, not just a standalone type of thing. So it needs to be tied in with your purchasing decisions or your procurement decisions, and you need to be continually driving improvement. I suspect everybody, if they're listening to this, if you've signed into this webinar and you're listening to this, this is at least of interest, if not vital importance to you. That tells me you're also working for a company that takes the right look on how you manage and run yourselves, and typically that means you're looking to drive continuous improvement. And so the question is, why wouldn't you expect that of your supply chain as well? So you want to continue to drive continuous improvement by lowering the thresholds, modifying your rules and requirements to make sure that everybody is continuing to improve. And what that means is you're eliminating risk, and you're making your business, more profitable, safer, better for the suppliers, better for your customers, and better for your stakeholders. So it's of critical importance that you look at it beyond a one-time event and try to drive continuous improvement. So having said that, I'm going to bring up on the screen here a list of the top 10 reasons that we've just discussed, and I'll leave this up here for your reference. And at this point, I think, Gareth, we can open it up for questions, or I think maybe you've already gotten a couple. I'm ready, and I'm sure Mark will chime in too if there are questions out there. We'll try to answer them with the time we have left.
That's great. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. I found that really interesting. Yeah, we've had a few questions in and a couple around similar themes. So we are a bit pushed for time, so I'm going to just try and cover what we can here. So the first question that I've got is that supply chain qualification is usually owned by the procurement function. Is this the same in the United States and in your previous experience at Caterpillar? And if not, who else can be involved?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I can tell you that I would say more often than not, at least 60% of the time, it typically is owned by multiple groups and not just purchasing or procurement. I hedged my bet on that because I've seen it go both ways. Clearly, the purchasing or the procurement group, they're a keystone element of the program and a key stakeholder. Some companies do put the whole ball of wax or the whole responsibility in with the purchasing group, but what I've seen more, and this applies, I had global responsibility at CAT, so I've been all over the world, and some of the clients that I work with at Browse are worldwide too. What I more typically see is it's a team approach and ownership, where you've got kind of the stakeholders that we talked about at the beginning working on it as a team. It may be driven through the purchasing process, but typically it's designed and there's co-ownership amongst your purchasing. Typically safety is a key part of it because that's one of the reasons that drives it. But those groups, you may have a little bit of legal involvement in it depending on your country and your legal, but typically it's more of a team event based on who you've identified as your key stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and as we are a little bit tight on time now, I think we'll just have time for one more question. We did have a couple based around the compliance aspect, and this one is about whether you can provide some insight into what kind of technology and tools exist out there that can actually support the compliance aspect of supply chain qualification program.
Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, I'm not trying to sound like a salesman. Again, I think I told you guys I'm a health and safety professional by trade and education, but that's where a good third-party supply chain management company like Browse or any of our competitors worldwide or whatever, I think that's where they can really help, because typically they'll have a well-developed platform and a tool that can automate a lot of the things for you. It can let you know when contractors are no longer meeting your qualification requirements. It can let you know when things like, for instance, insurance certificates are coming due or about to expire. It can let you know when, for instance, if one of your requirements is a management system or a safety manual, whatever you want to call it, that's critical to a lot of people that do this. Does it meet the regulatory requirements, and is the company using that? That sophisticated technology helps you manage all of that type of stuff, not by looking at spreadsheets, by systems that can generate, automatic notifications of failures, of impending failures, of things coming due, and then having experts in that area to back up that kind of the technological side of it, but having, employees that are responsible for working with the suppliers to, to keep them compliant. It makes a really big difference. We had tried doing some of the things in-house at CAT, and actually when I kicked it off at CAT, I went out and benchmarked. It was 13 Fortune 500 companies before we started our project, and we found a similar story in that most of the companies we benchmarked initially did it in-house and just found that, again, kind of the managing by spreadsheet thing just wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't automated enough to provide them the value they were expecting to get from their process. So I'm not sure if that answered the question or not. I don't know, Mark, do you have anything to add into that?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, just as an idea on maybe some software elements. I think was maybe something that might be tied to the finance side, finance and procurement for clients or organizations is maybe an element or tool such as I know a lot of companies Dun & Bradstreet reports on their contractors before they're or right as they're going under contract with them. There's some elements out there we utilize at Browse that actually works partnering with Experian to develop a financial stability risk score, which can be generated monthly or quarterly or at least annually for procurement to take a look at that contract. So obviously they might be looking quite well at the beginning of a contract, but this actually lets them monitor that progressively over time as the contract continues out until it's completed. So I thought that might be just one example that might help answer that question.
Yeah, that is a good example. A lot of times, especially the more sophisticated the companies, they'll integrate their pre-qualification process tool platform provided by a third party in with their purchasing, whether they're using SAP or something like that. You can integrate those systems so that they're talking and sharing information, which really, again, it helps speed up the process, helps eliminate the risk of of human error, oversight, or whatever. And especially, I did a lot of work with the purchasing folks at CAT. It really streamlined our purchasing process by having those systems talk and share information, which you just can't do, manually or with a spreadsheet or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm afraid to report we have reached our time limit for the webinar. I'd like to say thank you very much, both to Mark and to Gil, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure co-hosting this with you. I'd like to let all of our attendees know that we're going to be sending out a PDF of the presentation after the event if you would like to refer back to it. And thank you very much for joining this webinar presented in conjunction with Browse and the ProcureCon suite of events. I've been Gareth Becker. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.